How did I get here? One moment, the sterile hum of the ICU, the rhythmic beep of monitors, the acrid scent of betadine and fear. The next, this. This primitive stench of damp earth, unwashed bodies, and something cloyingly sweet, like decay. My scrubs, once a pristine shield against the chaos of life and death, now clung to me, heavy with mud and grime, a grotesque parody of their original purpose. Rain, not the clean urban drizzle of Seoul, but a heavy, relentless downpour drummed on a roof I could barely see through the flickering, smoky light. I was cold, achingly so, and the ache in my head was a dull, persistent throb, far worse than any post-op migraine. Voices, a harsh, unfamiliar cadence, whispered around me. Fear. That was the universal language I understood, and it permeated the air, thick as the smoke from the central hearth. They were looking at me, eyes wide, dark, and utterly terrified. A ghost, they called me. A spirit. I, Dr. Naomi Vance, the surgeon who hadn't lost a patient in years, the ghost of the operating theater, reduced to a mud-stained apparition in a world that made no sense. This wasn't right. None of it was right. I needed a drink. I needed a scalpel. I needed to wake up. The air in Operating Theater 3 hummed with the electric tension of a high-stakes gamble. Dr. Naomi Vance, draped in sterile green, moved with a fluid precision that belied the 14 hours already etched into her posture. Her hands, encased in latex, were extensions of a mind that saw not flesh and bone, but systems, interconnected, complex, and currently failing. This was the final stretch of a pancreatico-duodenectomy, a Whipple procedure, notoriously brutal, unforgiving. The patient, a septuagenarian with more will than viable tissue, clung to life by a thread Naomi had meticulously woven. Her perfect streak, years without a single postoperative fatality, wasn't about ego, not entirely. It was about control, about proving that even in the chaotic dance with death, there was an order she could impose. "Retractor, please." Her voice, a low, steady command, cut through the quiet tension. The scrub nurse, a seasoned veteran who had seen younger surgeons crumble, moved without hesitation. Naomi's gaze, usually unyielding, flickered for a microsecond to the clock. 2:17 a.m. Seoul glittered outside the hospital's triple-paned windows, a galaxy of neon promises she wouldn't keep tonight. Her own body screamed for rest, for oblivion, for the burn of scotch against her throat. The final stitch was placed, a work of art in human tissue. "Closing," she announced, the single word a benediction. The relief in the room was palpable, a collective exhalation. Naomi didn't linger. She shed her gloves, peeled off her mask, the ghost of an indentation on her high cheekbones. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, held a deep-seated weariness that no amount of sleep could truly banish. She was a god in this sterile temple, capable of bending life and death to her will, yet profoundly, exquisitely human in her need to escape. The burden of that power. In her private office, a Spartan sanctuary of glass and steel overlooking the city, the bottle of 12-year-old scotch waited. It wasn't a choice. It was a ritual. Each amber swallow was a tiny act of rebellion against the constant vigilance, the relentless pressure. The burn wasn't just physical. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of the perfect facade, a descent into the comfortable blur where the lines between success and failure, life and death, softened. Rain began to lash against the immense window, blurring the already impressionistic sprawl of neon. The vibrant energy of Seoul, usually a stimulant, now felt like a crushing weight. She had another surgery scheduled for 7 a.m. 4 hours. Enough time for the alcohol to work its magic, to dull the edges of her triumphs and failures alike, and then to, hopefully, miraculously, dissipate before she had to wield a scalpel again. It was a dangerous dance she had perfected, a secret kept hidden beneath layers of professional competence and an almost superhuman dedication. But tonight, the scotch worked too fast, or perhaps the exhaustion was deeper than usual. The familiar hum of the city, filtered through the rain, morphed into a distant roar. The sleek sedan, a discreet symbol of her success, cut a path through the deluge. Headlights streaked across the wet asphalt, painting transient masterpieces of light and reflection. The wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour, blurring the already indistinct world outside. Naomi gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the endless stream of red taillights ahead. Her mind, usually a finely tuned instrument, was sluggish, clouded. A sudden swerve, a flash of white from a merging taxi, and the world fractured. The screech of tires was a primal scream, echoing the silent one trapped in her own throat. Metal shrieked, glass exploded. The car spun, a dizzying carousel of violent motion, the neon-lit cityscape becoming a kaleidoscope of destructive beauty. Then, with a sickening thud, impact. Silence. Not the kind of silence found in a quiet room, but the profound, deafening void left after an explosion. The world tilted, then went black. For a moment, she hung suspended in a terrifying limbo, neither here nor there. When consciousness flickered back, it was not with clarity, but with a profound disorientation. The scent of ozone, burnt rubber, and something else, something earthy, damp, and utterly alien. A dull throb began behind her eyes, the insistent drumbeat of a new, horrifying reality. Her body ached in places she hadn't known existed. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. The rain, she realized, was still falling, but it no longer sounded like the drumming on her car roof. It was falling on her, directly, through what felt like a gaping hole in reality itself. A harsh, metallic taste coated Naomi's tongue, mingling with the acrid tang of mud and fear. Her eyes fluttered open, struggling to process the profound darkness. Gone were the familiar sterile whites of her car's airbag or the familiar blues of hospital scrubs. Instead, she lay on something coarse and yielding. Straw. The air was thick, suffocating, a pungent cocktail of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something subtly, profoundly wrong. Not wrong like a medical emergency, but wrong like an impossible equation. Her head throbbed, a dull, insistent drumbeat behind her eyes, each pulse an echo of the collision that now felt like a lifetime ago. She tried to sit up, her muscles screaming in protest. Her rhyomph, thankfully, responded, but felt heavy, unresponsive, as if weighed down by an invisible burden. As her vision slowly adjusted to the gloom, shapes began to coalesce. Rough-hewn wooden beams crisscrossed above her, supporting a roof of tightly packed thatch. The floor beneath her was damp earth, cold and unforgiving. Her scrubs, once a symbol of her authority and precision, were now mud-stained, ripped in places, and clinging uncomfortably to her skin. The sensation of the foreign fabric, a coarse, almost burlap-like texture beneath her fingers, was jarring. These weren't her expensive, high-tech threads. No, this was different. A gasp, sharp and sudden, sliced through the stifling quiet. Naomi's gaze snapped to the source. Two figures, shrouded in what appeared to be voluminous, dark fabric, stood frozen near the hut's entrance, their eyes wide and fixed on her. Fear. It radiated from them, palpable and chilling. They didn't just look scared, they looked utterly terrified, as if she were a monstrous apparition. Their faces, dimly lit by a flickering oil lamp, were unfamiliar, with distinct features that spoke of an ancient lineage. Their clothing, an elegant but simple arrangement of layered cloth, was unlike anything she had ever seen outside a museum exhibit. "Guisin," one of them stammered, their voice a reedy whisper, barely audible. "The ghost." Naomi frowned, her confusion deepening. "Guisin? Ghost?" Her mind, still sluggish, struggled to piece together the fragments of memory. The crash, the impact, the sudden, impossible shift. This wasn't a hospital. This wasn't even a familiar part of Seoul. The air was too raw, too unpolluted, too ancient. A quick, frantic self-assessment. No obvious broken bones, but a dizzying disorientation. Her medical bag, her phone, her car keys, all gone. Her sophisticated tools, the very extensions of her surgical genius, were utterly absent. This realization hit her with a physical force, a cold dread seeping into her bones. More figures began to emerge from the shadows, their hushed whispers filling the small space. Faces, weathered and etched with hardship, peered at her with a mixture of terror and morbid fascination. They pointed, their fingers trembling. "Almana," someone else murmured, the word translating roughly to "how much." How much what? How much longer until the ghost left? How much pain would it inflict? The sheer, unadulterated fear in their eyes was unsettling. Naomi, accustomed to being the one in control, the one who calmed the anxious, found herself in the inverse position. She was the anomaly, the intruder, the source of their terror. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. What language would they understand? Her perfectly articulated Korean, honed in the precise world of modern medicine, felt suddenly foreign, useless. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of her professional composure. This wasn't a dream. The mud was too real, the chill too penetrating, the fear radiating from these strangers too visceral. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had sliced through muscle and bone with unwavering certainty, that had held life and death in their delicate grip. They were still her hands, but they felt strangely detached, alien in this crude, unfamiliar setting. The metallic glint of a tiny silver ring, a gift from her mentor, was still on her finger, a solitary, gleaming tether to the world she knew. A young woman, no older than a teenager, stumbled back, tripping over a low stool. A small wooden bowl of water clattered to the floor, splashing on the mud. The water, dark and murky, confirmed her growing dread. This was not the soul of 2026. This was something far older, far more primitive. A world utterly devoid of the conveniences and sanitary practices she took for granted. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and profound misunderstanding. Naomi, the god of modern medicine, was adrift in an ocean of superstition, her skills rendered meaningless without her tools, her very presence a terrifying mystery. The sun, a pale, anemic disk, began to filter through the cracks in the hut's wooden walls, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the heavy air. A silent testament to the passage of time she could not comprehend. The stench hit Naomi first, a visceral assault on her senses that made her stomach churn. Not the controlled, clinical odor of disease in a hospital, but the raw, unmitigated reek of human waste, vomit, and death. Her professional instincts, honed over decades, immediately identified the enemy. Cholera. It swept through the small village like a reaper, claiming children first, then the elderly, leaving a trail of desiccated bodies and terrified survivors. They called it the evil spirit, a demonic possession, a curse from angry ancestors. Naomi called it Vibrio cholerae, spread by contaminated water. Her initial attempts to communicate were met with either terrified silence or guttural, incomprehensible cries. Her modern Korean, filled with medical jargon, might as well have been Martian. Yet the universal language of suffering transcended the linguistic barrier. She saw the glazed eyes, the sunken cheeks, the rapid, shallow breathing, all textbook symptoms. The villagers, desperate and ignorant, performed rituals, burning incense, chanting, offering meager food to unseen spirits. It was heartbreakingly futile. "This is not a spirit," Naomi muttered to herself, her voice hoarse from disuse. "This is bacteria. We need clean water." Her mind, despite the lingering fog of confusion and the persistent ache in her head, began to click into its familiar problem-solving mode. Without a lab, without antibiotics, without IV fluids, her hands were tied. But she wasn't entirely helpless. Her knowledge was her weapon. She stumbled out of the hut, her mud-stained scrubs a stark contrast to the rough hanboks worn by the villagers. The village itself was a collection of dilapidated wooden shacks and thatch roofs, clustered around a central well. The well, she quickly surmised, was the source. It was poorly maintained, open to the elements, and likely contaminated by runoff. She pointed to it, then mimed drinking and clutching her stomach, trying to convey the danger. The villagers recoiled, whispering amongst themselves, their fear of her now tinged with a flicker of confusion. Her gaze fell upon a pile of ash near a smoldering fire pit, remnants of a ritual. Lye. A crude but potent disinfectant. She also spotted large clay pots, usually used for fermenting kimchi, and, crucially, a source of firewood. "Water," she grunted, pointing to the well, then making a boiling motion with her hand over the fire. "Boil. Heat." A young woman, no older than 15, approached cautiously, holding a small, emaciated child. The child's eyes were rolled back, his breathing shallow. Naomi knelt, her fingers automatically seeking a pulse. Faint, thready. This child was dying. She remembered the faces of children in her ICU, hooked up to machines, tiny bodies fighting for every breath. Here there were no machines, no miracles, only her. Her pride, that ingrained sense of invincibility, flared. She hadn't lost a patient in years, and she wasn't about to start now, not even in this God-forsaken past. She grabbed a large clay pot, ignoring the startled gasps of the villagers. Pointing to the well, she gestured for them to fill it. After much hesitation, a grizzled old man, his face a roadmap of hardship, cautiously complied. Naomi then directed them to build a larger fire. She waited for the water to reach a rolling boil, then demonstrated how to carefully pour it into smaller, clean vessels, and, crucially, let it cool before drinking. Next, the soap, a critical component. She found a mixture of animal fat and ash, a rudimentary lye solution used for washing clothes. It was harsh, but it would work. She showed them how to wash their hands, vigorously, repeatedly. She demonstrated it on herself, rubbing her mud-caked hands together until a meager lather formed, explaining through gestures that this cleansing would drive away the evil spirits on their skin. "The cleansing of the ghost," the old man whispered, his eyes wide as he watched Naomi scrub. The moniker stuck. They feared her, but they also recognized the undeniable, if unsettling, effectiveness of her strange rituals. Slowly, tentatively, a few brave souls began to follow her instructions. They boiled water, they washed their hands, they even began to clean the surfaces of their huts. It was a slow, agonizing process, akin to teaching advanced algebra to a group who had never seen numbers. The sick child, given spoonfuls of boiled water, miraculously began to stabilize, his breathing easing, his eyes regaining a faint flicker of awareness. This tangible success, an irrefutable defiance of the evil spirit, solidified Naomi's terrifying new status. She wasn't just a Guishin. She was a powerful Guishin, one who could manipulate the spirits of disease. Her methods were bizarre, her presence unnerving, but the results were undeniable. The fear remained, but now it was tinged with a grudging respect, an unspoken plea for continued, terrifying intervention. Naomi, the ghost, had found her new operating theater, a mud-floored stage where she would perform her brutal, unsanctioned miracles. She was saving lives, but she knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning of her new nightmare. The cleansing of the ghost had done its work. The cholera outbreak, once a rampant inferno of death, was now merely smoldering embers. Lives had been saved, not by shamanic chants or elaborate rituals, but by boiled water and crude lye soap. The villagers, though still wary, had begun to cautiously regard Naomi with a mixture of awe and fear. Her reputation, born of fear and inexplicable cures, spread beyond the confines of their isolated hamlet, whispered from merchant to traveler, from farmer to soldier. It reached the ears of the powerful, those who understood that such strange, potent magic could be a tool or a threat. One brisk morning, a detachment of royal guards, resplendent in their polished armor and traditional conical hats, rode into the village. Their horses snorted, hooves clattering on the packed earth, disrupting the quiet rhythm of village life. Panic flared through the community. These were not messengers of peace. Naomi, hunched over a steaming pot of water, teaching a young mother the importance of hand-washing before preparing food, felt the familiar prickle of dread. Her precarious peace, forged in the crucible of medical necessity, was about to shatter. The guards dismounted, their movements precise and intimidating. Their leader, a stern-faced officer whose gaze was as sharp as his sword, pointed directly at Naomi. "You," he commanded, his voice deep and authoritative. "The woman who banishes spirits. You are summoned to the palace." Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs. The palace, the center of power, intrigue, and rigid tradition. Her mud-stained scrubs, once a symbol of her commitment to healing, now felt like a peasant's rags. She was no longer just a ghost. She was a curiosity, an anomaly deemed worthy of royal attention. She tried to protest, to explain that she was a doctor, not a sorceress. But the words were useless. The guards didn't understand, nor did they care. She was an order, to be executed. Rough hands seized her arms. She struggled, instinctively fighting against the capture, but their grip was unyielding. The villagers, their faces a mixture of sorrow and relief, averted their eyes. Their ghost was being taken, perhaps to appease the very spirits she claimed to banish. As she was dragged away, Her gaze swept over the desperate faces, over the now clean water pots and the steaming fire pits. A grudging sense of accomplishment mingled with the cold dread. She had saved them, against all odds. Now, she was to be rewarded with the unpredictable whims of a king. The journey to the palace was long and arduous, a jarring contrast to the smooth, insulated ride of her sedan. She was forced to walk, her bare feet soon caked with mud and dust. The grandeur of the capital, with its bustling markets and more elaborate hanoks, unfolded around her. People stared, whispered, pointed. Her dark skin, her strange clothing, her defiant stance. She was an alien in a land that prided itself on its homogeneous culture. Finally, they reached the imposing gates of the royal palace. The architecture was breathtaking. Sweeping tiled roofs, vibrant painted eaves, intricately carved wooden pillars. It exuded an ancient majesty, a silent testament to centuries of power. But for Naomi, it was just another operating theater, albeit one with much higher stakes and far fewer amenities. She was led through a labyrinth of courtyards and halls, past richly adorned courtiers who eyed her with undisguised suspicion. The air grew heavier, thick with incense and the unspoken weight of centuries of tradition. Finally, she was brought into a grand chamber, its polished wooden floors gleaming, its walls adorned with exquisite tapestries depicting mythical beasts and historical battles. At the far end, seated on a raised dais, was the king. His robes were of vibrant red and gold, his expression stern and unyielding. Flanking him were his most trusted advisors, their faces impassive. And then, Naomi saw him. Prince Li Hui. He lay on a silk-draped bed, his face pale and drawn, his breathing shallow and ragged. A single glance was enough for Naomi to recognize the signs of advanced pneumonia, perhaps exacerbated by a secondary infection. His youthful body, once vibrant, was now a fragile vessel teetering on the edge of oblivion. Opposite her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of contempt and fear, stood Courtier Park, the head physician. His traditional robes were immaculate, his demeanor haughty. He was everything Naomi detested, a man clinging to outdated dogma, threatened by anything that challenged his authority. "This is the woman?" Courtier Park sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "The ghost who dabbles in dark arts. She dares defile His Royal Highness with her unholy presence." The king raised a hand, silencing him. His gaze, sharp and assessing, pierced Naomi. "You claim to banish evil spirits," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "My son is afflicted by a powerful one. Can you save him?" Naomi felt a surge of defiance. She was not a witch. She was a surgeon. But to deny their superstitions was to sign her own death warrant, her perfect streak, her pride. They demanded she act. She looked at the dying prince, then at the king, then at the sneering Courtier Park. This wasn't about spirits. This was about power, about survival, about proving that her knowledge, even without her tools, was undeniable. The silent battle had begun. She was no longer just a healer. She was a combatant, forced to fight for her life with every breath she took. The air in the prince's chamber was thick with the scent of traditional herbal medicines, pungent, earthy, and utterly ineffectual against the ravages of advanced pneumonia. Naomi stood over Prince Li Hui, her posture conveying a calm she didn't feel. His breathing was a shallow, rattling gasp, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a faint wheeze. His skin, beneath the royal silks, was ashen, clammy, and a feverish flush painted his gaunt cheeks. Her medical training screamed for a modern ICU, for a ventilator, for powerful antibiotics, for the clean, controlled environment of a surgical theater. Here, she had none of it. Only her wits, her hands, and the primitive, often hostile resources of 14th century Korea. Courtier Park hovered nearby, a vulture circling its prey, his eyes narrowed in disdain. "What sorcery will she attempt now?" he murmured, loud enough for the guards stationed around the room to hear. The implication was clear. If the prince died, Naomi was a witch, and her fate sealed. If he lived, she was still a witch, but a useful one. For now. Naomi ignored him, her focus absolute. She gently lifted the prince's silk tunic, exposing his chest. Her fingers, accustomed to the precise contours of human anatomy, delicately palpated his rib cage, listening to the congested sounds emanating from his lungs. Consolidation. Effusion. Her mind raced, sifting through decades of knowledge, searching for parallels, for adaptations. "He needs air," she declared, her voice rough but firm. "His lungs are drowning." Courtier Park scoffed. "We have given him the finest elixirs, applied sacred poultices. His spirit is simply too weak to fight the evil." "His spirit is fine," Naomi retorted, her frustration momentarily eclipsing caution. "His body is failing. We need to drain the fluid." The concept of a chest drain was as alien to them as a rocket ship. She needed a tube, a trocar, suction. All impossible. Her gaze swept the room, desperately seeking a solution. Her eyes landed on a collection of ornamental silver hairpins belonging to the prince's female attendants. One, long and slender, with a sharpened tip, caught her attention. It was not sterile, but it was metal, and she could improvise sterilization with fire. "Bring me hot coals," she commanded the guards, who stared at her bewildered. "And clean cloth, many layers." After a moment of confused hesitation, a guard fetched a brazier of glowing embers. Naomi took the silver hairpin, its intricate design a stark contrast to its new, horrifying purpose. She held the tip to the coals, watching it glow red, her movements deliberate, unhurried. The faint hiss and the smell of scorching metal filled the chamber. Courtier Park gasped, recoiling as if she held a venomous serpent. "What treachery is this?" he shrieked. "She means to pierce His Royal Highness." The king, who had been observing in stoic silence from behind a screen, spoke, his voice cold. "Her life is forfeit if my son is harmed further." "And his life is forfeit if I do nothing," Naomi shot back, her gaze locking with his, daring him to challenge her. Her own life hung by a thread thinner than any suture, but her pride, her professional stubbornness, refused to yield. She quickly fashioned a rudimentary antiseptic. Chewing on a leaf from a plant she recognized as a mild astringent, she spat the macerated pulp onto a piece of clean cloth, using it to wipe the prince's skin. Not sterile, but better than nothing. With a surgeon's ingrained muscle memory, she found the intercostal space. Her hand, steady and unyielding, plunged the hot silver needle into the prince's chest. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The prince cried out, a weak, pained sound. Courtier Park screamed, "Witch! Sorceress! You stab the king's son!" But Naomi ignored them. A thick, yellowish fluid, mixed with streaks of blood, began to seep from the puncture wound. A wave of relief, potent and almost dizzying, washed over her. It was working. The pressure on his lungs would ease. Now, for antibiotics. She had already observed the moldy grains and various fungi growing on damp surfaces in the palace and village. She needed penicillin, or at least a crude form of it. Her mind raced back to basic microbiology. She had seen Penicillium notatum growing on stale bread in the village. It was a long shot, dangerously unrefined, but it was all she had. "Find me moldy bread," she demanded, her voice tight with urgency, "and fermented grain, old, very old." A young palace servant, more terrified of Naomi than of Courtier Park, scurried off. When he returned, Naomi, using a clean wooden bowl, began to carefully scrape the green-blue mold from the bread. She mixed it with the fermented grain, adding a little boiled water. The mixture was crude, impure, and potentially toxic. But in her desperate situation, it was the best she could do. She would administer it in small, frequent doses, praying the beneficial effects outweighed the risks. The prince, though still weak, was breathing slightly easier. The immediate crisis of the drowning lung had been averted. But Naomi knew this was just the first battle. He was still desperately ill, and she was surrounded by enemies who saw her as a demon. Her perfect streak was on the line. But more importantly, so was her life. The poisonous crown, she realized, wasn't just on the king's head. It was settling on her own, its weight a crushing reminder of the impossible debt she was now incurring. She had saved the prince, but in doing so, she had chained herself to his fate. The scent of blood and fear clung to the prince's chamber, even after the initial rush of fluid from his chest had subsided. Prince Li Hui lay weakly on the bed, his breathing still labored but undeniably less frantic. The makeshift chest drain, a piece of hollowed reed carefully inserted into the silver needle's track and held by strips of silk, was a crude marvel, a testament to Naomi's desperate ingenuity. But the relief in the room was short-lived, quickly overshadowed by Courtier Park's escalating fury. "You have poisoned him," Park shrieked, his voice echoing off the ornate wooden walls. He pointed a trembling finger at Naomi, his eyes blazing with a fanatical zeal.
"This is no healing. This is a black ritual, a demonic possession. She pierced the prince's very essence, filling him with foul humors from her dark concoctions."
He gestured wildly at the crude penicillin mixture Naomi had prepared.
"This mold, this filth, it will surely consume him."
The king's face, usually a mask of regal composure, was now etched with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. He looked from his weakly breathing son to the wild-eyed physician, then to Naomi, her mud-stained scrubs and defiant posture a stark contrast to the court's opulence. The sight of the fluid draining from the prince, a visible and shocking affront to their traditional understanding of the body, was undeniable. But so was Park's passionate accusation.
"She is a Grishin, Your Majesty,"
Park pressed, seizing the moment.
"A spirit of pestilence, disguised as a healer. She brings foul odors and strange customs, and now she assaults your son with iron and rot. This is witchcraft, pure and unadulterated."
The royal guards, who had been standing rigidly at attention, now shifted, their hands moving instinctively to the hilts of their swords. The king's gaze, previously discerning, hardened. The concept of witchcraft, of dark, uncontrollable forces, was far more palatable than the terrifying notion that their ancient medicine was impotent.
"Seize her," the king commanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and terror. "Burn the witch."
The guards moved as one, a wave of armored fury. Naomi, her heart hammering against her ribs, instinctively reacted. Years of surgical precision had honed her reflexes,
taught her to analyze threats and movements in milliseconds. These men were trained warriors, but they were also unaccustomed to facing an opponent who moved with the calculated ferocity of a surgeon fighting for a patient's life. Or her own. She ducked under the first guard's clumsy lunge, sidestepping his heavy armor. Her eyes darted around the room, assessing every potential weapon, every avenue of escape. The chamber was a death trap. Her hands, however, were still her greatest tools. As another guard swung a heavy, ornate sword, she met his arm not with force, but with a precise, almost delicate block, deflecting the blade and throwing him off balance. Her palm connected with his chin, a sharp, unexpected strike that rattled his teeth. He stumbled back, momentarily stunned. "She uses black magic," Courtier Park shrieked, scrambling behind the king. "She bewitches them." Naomi knew she couldn't fight her way out. She had to outsmart them. Her gaze landed on the complex series of screens and tapestries that partitioned the large chamber. An escape route. "The prince needs more of the medicine," she cried, hoping to create a diversion, her voice cutting through the chaos. She pointed frantically at the crude penicillin mixture. "If you stop me, he dies." It was a desperate gamble, playing on their fear for the prince. The king hesitated, his eyes flicking between Naomi and his son. That split second was all Naomi needed. As two more guards advanced, she snatched a long silk hanging from the wall, whipping it around the neck of the nearest guard. She pulled, using his own momentum against him, sending him sprawling. His helmet clattered against the polished floor. Before the second guard could react, Naomi had already vaulted over the prone form of the first, a fluid, unexpected movement that surprised them all. She dashed towards the screens, tearing through them, creating a momentary visual chaos. The palace, once a grand, labyrinthine maze, now became her desperate escape route. She ran through corridors she had barely glimpsed, her bare feet slapping against the cold wooden floors. The sounds of pursuit, shouting, heavy footsteps, the clinking of armor, echoed behind her. She was a ghost indeed, now fleeing for her life. Her mind was a whirlwind of calculations, each turn a choice between life and death. She remembered the large open-air courtyard they had crossed earlier, surrounded by buildings and a high wall. If she could reach that, perhaps she could scale it. But the guards were relentless, their knowledge of the palace far superior. As she rounded a corner, she found herself face to face with a squad of armored men, their swords drawn, their faces grim. Trapped. A small, ornate table, laden with porcelain teacups and silver implements, stood nearby. Naomi, with a desperate surge of adrenaline, grabbed a heavy porcelain teapot. With a grunt, she hurled it at the closest guard's head. It shattered on impact, momentarily disorienting him. In the ensuing confusion, she made her move, not towards the open corridor, but towards a narrow, seldom-used service entrance she had noticed earlier, partially obscured by a hanging banner. She burst through the door, finding herself in a cluttered, dim storeroom filled with earthenware jars and bundles of straw. The air was thick with dust. She frantically pushed a stack of heavy jars in front of the door, creating a temporary barricade. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she didn't stop. The sounds of the guards outside, cursing and banging on the makeshift barrier, spurred her on. She squeezed through a narrow opening in the back of the storeroom, finding herself in a small, overgrown garden. Beyond it, she could just make out the top of the palace wall. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm. She was still trapped, still hunted, but she had bought herself a few precious moments. Her intelligence, her surgical precision in identifying weak points and exploiting them, had saved her. For now. But her precarious existence had just taken a far more dangerous turn. She was not just a foreign doctor.
She was now an escaped witch, and the entire kingdom would soon be hunting her down. Naomi huddled in the hollow of a gnarled old tree, the rough bark digging into her back, the chill of the night seeping into her bones. She was outside the palace walls now, having scaled them in a desperate, adrenaline-fueled scramble that had left her scrubs even more tattered and her skin scraped raw. The moon, a thin sliver in the vast, inky sky, offered little light. The sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, were a stark contrast to the sterile hum of her former life. She was utterly alone, an alien in a land that wanted her dead. Her mind, however, refused to succumb to despair. Prince Li Hui was still hovering between life and death, and without her, he would surely perish. Her perfect streak demanded she see this through, even if it cost her everything. But her medical bag, her life-sustaining arsenal of tools and medications, was gone. She had only her knowledge, her hands, and the scant resources of a primitive world. The crude penicillin mixture she had concocted, a dangerous gamble even in the best circumstances, was nearly depleted. She needed more. But this time, she couldn't rely on a palace servant to bring her moldy bread. She needed to source her own materials, to become a true alchemist of survival. Driven by a desperate urgency, Naomi spent the following day scouring the forest and the periphery of the village, avoiding detection by the pervasive palace guards. She searched for anything that resembled Penicillium notatum, her eyes trained to spot the distinctive green-blue bloom on damp wood, decaying leaves, or, most promisingly, stale grain. She found it eventually, a patch of vivid blue-green fur on a discarded rain-soaked rice cake. It was a meager supply, but it was a start. Next, she needed a medium to cultivate it, something fermented. She observed the villagers, cautiously from a distance, watching their daily routines. She saw them preparing makgeolli, a traditional rice wine, and other fermented foods. She needed a source of starch and yeast. Under the cover of darkness, she crept into a deserted section of the village, managing to acquire a small quantity of fermented rice paste and a handful of discarded moldy beans. It was dangerous, risky, and a far cry from the controlled conditions of a pharmaceutical lab. But necessity was the cruelest inventor. Back in her hiding place, a small, abandoned shed near the forest's edge, Naomi began her crude pharmaceutical operation. She mashed the moldy rice. The air in the prince's hidden chamber was a stagnant soup of iron, guttering tallow, and the frantic, shallow gasps of the dying. Outside, the palace had become a drum of chaotic thunder. The heavy oak doors groaned, shuddering under the rhythmic assault of a battering ram. Courtier Park's voice rose above the din, a shrill, hysterical anthem. "Break the doors! Slay the witch before she consumes the prince's soul! If he dies in her presence, the curse is eternal." Naomi didn't look up. Her world had narrowed to the 6 inches of exposed pale flesh on Prince Li Hui's chest. He had flatlined, not with the electronic scream of a modern monitor, but with the terrifying, sudden stillness of a heart that had simply given up under the weight of sepsis. "Not today," she hissed through gritted teeth. Her hands, calloused from days of primitive labor and stained with the green-blue mold of her makeshift antibiotics, were steady. She had no defibrillator, no epinephrine, no crash cart. She only had the physics of the human body. She took a breath, centered her weight, and delivered a sharp, calculated precordial thump to the center of his sternum. The sound, a dull thud, echoed in the silent room. Nothing.
She began manual compressions, the rhythm a ghost of the top 40 hits she used to hum in the Soul OR. 1, 2, 3. The wooden bed frame creaked under the pressure. 1, 2, 3. A crack split the door. A sliver of torchlight flickered into the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing like tiny spirits. The stimulant, Naomi barked at the terrified servant girl trembling in the corner. The concentrated ginger and the foxglove root I boiled. Now!
She took the vial. She had no syringe. Instead, she used a sharpened silver quill she'd hollowed out with a needle file. She positioned it between the 4th and 5th ribs. It was a move of pure desperation, an intracardiac injection with a primitive delivery system. If she hit the wrong spot, she would cause a tamponade and kill him instantly. She plunged the quill. The prince's body jolted. The door finally burst. Wood splinters flew like shrapnel. Royal guards, blades unsheathed, flooded the room. Courtier Park stepped forward, his face a mask of fanatical triumph. "Executioner, take her head. The prince is cold. The witch has eaten his life." In that heartbeat, the prince's chest lurched. A ragged, wet gasp tore from his throat. His eyes snapped open, not with peace, but with a clouded, primal agony. His hand spasmodically caught Naomi's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong, his fingernails digging into her skin. The guards froze. The silence was heavier than the noise had been. Naomi looked at the guards, then at Park, her eyes cold and predatory. "The prince lives," she said, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. "Which of you wants to be the one to kill the only woman who can keep him that way?" The morning light was gray and unforgiving as it filtered through the paper screens, casting long, geometric shadows across the floor. The immediate threat of the executioner's blade had retreated, replaced by a suffocating, uneasy reverence. Naomi sat on a silk cushion, her tattered scrubs a grotesque, blood-brown smudge against the palace's pristine elegance. Across from her, propped up by embroidered pillows, sat Li Hui. He looked at her not with gratitude, but with the profound, shivering dread one might reserve for a beautiful monster. He knew what she had done. He had felt his soul leave, and felt her reach into the void to drag it back by the throat. "You are not a witch," he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding stones. "A witch uses spirits. You use the body like a carpenter uses wood. You see the meat and the bone, not the man." "I saved you," Naomi said, her voice devoid of warmth. She was tired of the labels. Her pride was the only thing keeping her upright. "Your physicians would have prayed you into a coffin. I gave you my blood and my breath." "You did more than save me," the prince said, his gaze dropping to the crude bandage on his chest. "You have marked me. The court says I am tainted by your touch. They fear me now as much as they fear you. You haven't restored a prince. You've created an outcast." Naomi leaned forward, the ghost surgeon once again in total control. The seesaw of power had tilted. She wasn't his servant. He was her evidence. As long as he breathed, she was untouchable. But she knew the world's logic. His debt was so great, it would eventually turn to resentment. Emotional attachment was a luxury she couldn't afford. "They should fear you," she commanded, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You were dead, and I brought you back. That makes you a miracle. and it makes me the owner of that miracle. You will tell the king I am the royal hand. I am to have my own laboratory, my own supplies, and no interference from the cowards in the medical court." He nodded slowly, a prisoner of his own heartbeat. He was the poisoned crown, and she was the one who held the antidote. For the first time, Naomi felt the thrill of ascension. She wasn't just a doctor anymore. She was a shadow ruler. The coronation of her status should have been a triumph, but the air began to taste like ozone and copper. Naomi was walking through the palace gardens, the scent of pine and ancient earth filling her lungs, when the first tremor hit. It wasn't the earth shaking, it was the image of the earth. For a fraction of a second, the vibrant green of the pine needles desaturated into a sterile, fluorescent white. The chirping of birds cut out, replaced by a low-frequency hum. She stopped, clutching a stone lantern. The stone felt wrong. It felt like plastic. "Doctor," a voice called out. It sounded like Prince Li Hui, but it was layered with a strange electronic reverb, as if his words were being played through a broken speaker. She turned, and the palace wall rippled like a reflection in a disturbed pond. The stone turned into glass. The silk of her sleeves felt like paper. The heavy, sweet scent of incense was suddenly cut by a sharp, clinical blast of isopropyl alcohol and the metallic tang of hospital-grade blood. "No," she whispered, her hands shaking. "Not yet. I haven't finished the trial. I have work to do here." She saw the prince standing at the end of the walkway. He reached out to her, but his face began to fragment into pixels of light. The sky above didn't turn to night. It turned to a flat, gray ceiling with recessed lighting. The sounds of traditional flutes were drowned out by a persistent, rhythmic beep, beep, beep. "Stay!" she screamed, reaching for him. Her fingers brushed the silk of his robe, and for a moment the connection was solid. She felt the warmth of his skin. Then, a blinding, white-hot light swallowed the Joseon horizon. The garden vanished, the prince shattered. The air was sucked out of the world. The light was a violent assault. It burned through her eyelids like a laser, forcing a jagged groan from her throat. Naomi gasped, her lungs burning as if she hadn't taken a breath in centuries. Her eyes snapped open. She wasn't under a thatched roof or a palace eaves. She was staring at a perforated acoustic ceiling tile, a single dead fly trapped in the light fixture. "She's awake. Get Dr. Choi. Increase the O2. The sounds were a cacophony, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, the hiss of an oxygen flow, the frantic clicking of a keyboard. A nurse hovered over her, his face obscured by a surgical mask that looked too blue, too clean, too fake. "Dr. Vance, can you hear me? Look at the light. Follow my finger." Naomi tried to speak, but her throat was a desert. The prince, the infection." "You're disoriented, Naomi. You're at Seoul National University Hospital. You were in a horrific car accident. Your car flipped 3 times. She looked at her hands. They were clean. The dirt was gone. The scars from the palace garden were absent. Her heart sank into a cold, dark pit of disillusionment. It was a dream. A vivid, alcohol-induced hallucination triggered by her trauma and her obsession with her own surgical perfection. Her mind had invented a world where she was still the god in control, even when she was dying in a ditch. "The surgery," she rasped, her voice cracking. "The Whipple? The patient is fine. You made it home. Almost. You've been in a medically induced coma for 48 hours. She lay back, the sterile reality of 2026 crushing her. The prince, the witch trials, the improvised penicillin, all of it was just a brain trying to make sense of a dying spark. She felt a profound sense of erasure. The woman who ruled a palace was gone, replaced by a broken alcoholic in a hospital gown. Discharge was a blur of paperwork, physical therapy, and tough love from her department head about her lifestyle choices. Naomi stood in the hospital lobby, the soul rain mocking her from behind the glass. It looked just like the neon rain from the night of the crash, cold, indifferent, and expensive. She felt like a stranger in her own skin. The perfect streak surgeon was a ghost. She felt fragmented, as if half of her soul was still sitting in a dirt-floored hut in 1392, waiting for a prince who didn't exist. She reached into the pocket of her trench coat, the one she had been wearing during the accident, returned to her in a plastic patient belongings bag. She was looking for her car keys, her fingers trembling with a phantom craving for a drink. Her fingers brushed against something soft, something woven. She pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat. In the palm of her hand lay a blood-stained silk nordige. The intricate knots were damp, and the silk was frayed exactly where she had used it to tie the prince's makeshift chest tube. It smelled of ancient pine, wood smoke, and the copper tang of a 14th century infection. There was no scientific explanation. There was no medical logic. She looked up at her reflection in the glass. For a split second, the neon lights of Seoul flickered. Behind her own reflection, she didn't see the modern lobby. She saw the silhouette of Prince Li Hui, standing in the shadows of a palace hallway, his eyes full of that same terrifying, unpayable debt. The trial wasn't over. The power hadn't changed hands for the last time. It wasn't a dream, and it wasn't a coma. It was a substitution. She gripped the norige until the silk cut into her palm. She wasn't the ghost of the ICU anymore. She was something else entirely, a woman who had crossed the veil, and now the veil was following her home.